So my name's Andre Dua, and I'm a senior partner at McKinsey in New York. And the main thing that I do there is I run something called McKinsey Academy, which is McKinsey's own enterprise focused on corporate learning. And having now served a few hundred clients around the world, what I wanted to do is over the next 20 minutes, offer a very, very simple proposition, and then flesh that out. And that proposition is the following: that in the future, if you're not a learning organization, you won't be a living one. And my central thesis is that in nearly every organization, you're only as good as your people and the sum total of their capabilities. And if someone else has better leaders, better skills for the new economy, and better ways of working together, they're going to have the edge. If as an organization you're not constantly learning, my view is don't expect anymore to be an industry leader. Don't expect to be the innovator in your industry. Don't expect to be able to attract talent or hold on to it. So let me just illustrate the scale of the challenge by offering up the context in which today's companies are operating. So firstly, as you all know, and not all of this will be new, but put it all together and just think about what the implications are. So companies are more global, their org structures are more networked and matrixed, their supply chains span dozens of countries, their regulatory environments are very complex and changing all the time. Look at healthcare today. Their talent pools are global. They're dealing with macroeconomic and industry volatility. They're being disrupted by new players from all around the world, from industries they don't even expect. And then, of course, there's that whole shift to digital. And to top it all off, the very nature of work itself is changing through automation, AI, machine learning, not to mention other trends like the rise of the contractor and gig economy. So when you look at it this way, the scale of the challenge is actually quite unprecedented. And maybe one way to bring it to life is to take an example which perhaps we can all understand. Let's look at AT&T. So not too many years ago, AT&T had to compete with phone and wireless companies. It managed copper wires and cell towers. Then the internet and cloud computing happened in a very significant way. And now it finds that its competitors are really Amazon, Google, and Netflix. These are the new competitors. So think about this. AT&T now has 280,000 or so employees, and it has to prepare them to code, learn consumer-centric design, and data science to analyze the fire hose of data it gets. Imagine that, changing and improving the skills and capabilities of an organization of nearly 280,000 people, or someone else is going to take your business. And this, in my view, is not corporate learning as we've historically thought about it. The scale of this change is absolutely unprecedented. And AT&T is not alone. My thesis is that over the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see hundreds of companies embark on capability building programs of that scale, measured in hundreds of thousands of people. And that's absolutely unprecedented. So I think in that context, corporate learning as we know it needs to be reinvented. But let me just say a little bit more about that. What do we mean when we talk about the purpose of corporate learning? I'm going to argue that there's really one dominant purpose of corporate learning, and it's this: to transform talent so that it creates economic value. The purpose of corporate learning is to transform talent so it creates economic value. And that has huge implications for how we design and construct company-wide corporate learning. Perhaps let's just look at a few facts before we get into how this new world might evolve. And I just want to bring to light a few specific challenges that companies are facing. The first is that employers are struggling in so many ways. 40% of employers say that skill shortages are driving entry-level vacancies. Second, despite the challenges in the economy, particularly in the middle, a lot of employers can't fill the jobs they need in order to compete. For a couple of years now, it's been pretty consistently the case that there are 5 to 6 million unfilled jobs. So the labor market is not working in some way. And then there's the problem that we don't have the leadership capacity we need. I think there's a massive gap between the leadership we need and the leadership we've got. And finally, employers are struggling with this fact, which is they just don't know what part of their corporate learning is working. In advertising, they used to have this old adage that 50% of your advertising works, you just don't know which 50%. I think we'd be lucky if 50% of the corporate learning was working. So even if we don't know what necessarily works, we do know the benefits of investing in corporate learning. And I'm just going to pick a little sliver here. Let's take leadership and leadership development. At McKinsey, we've done a bunch of research to look at what's the dividend of better leadership. And what we found is the following. We think that those companies that perform or have top quartile levels of leadership outperform others by nearly 2 times on earnings. We've found that organizations that invest in developing leaders during significant transformations are nearly 2.5 times as likely to hit their performance targets. And we found that if you have what we call centered leadership capabilities, which are around self-awareness, managing energy, and other sorts of things, you're 4 times as likely to lead change successfully. So now let me talk a little bit about how does corporate learning drive talent to create value. So I want to say, what do we mean when we talk about the corporate learning system? I think that the corporate learning system has 5 elements. The first is we can call the current employee graph. So what do we mean by that? Well, the current employee graph is who do you have and what can they do? What are your employees capable of doing at a granular level? And most importantly, what value do those employees create? That's the current employee graph. Second is the future employee graph. And this is as important, if not more so, than the current one, which is where is your industry and company headed? And what roles do you need that will add the most value? The third is the overall learning architecture. What's the plan for who learns? When do they learn? How do they learn? And how is that learning experiential? And then the fourth element is what are the programs that are connected to value? So what are the courses, the fieldwork, the projects, and the relevant skills people need to drive value creation? And finally, how do you evaluate that value creation? And I'm going to come back to this, but how many times has anyone been in a conversation where someone has challenged you on the amount that's invested in professional development or some kind of learning? And it's because we simply don't have a robust enough connection to business performance and value creation. So I believe that these 5 elements working in concert form the overall corporate learning system. Now, when we talk about corporate learning, we're really talking about training or developing the capabilities of these 4 sets of people. I'll characterize first as the generals. These are the leaders and managers. And we used to think of these in the hundreds. In fact, Jack Welch used to talk about the top 300. But in vast global enterprises, this is now measured in tens of thousands of people. Then we have the technicians. These are the people with specific capabilities and specific functional knowledge. These are the supply chain experts, the people doing pharmaceutical R&D, the finance people, the sales and marketing people, the social media experts, and other people with deep functional capabilities. And then, of course, you've got the front line. These are the customer service reps, the retail associates, the sales force. And they're the people who fundamentally shape the relationship between you and your company. But just as importantly is the pipeline. It's not just the people you have in your company that are part of your enterprise learning system, it's the people you want. And interestingly, depending on the kind of people you want, this pipeline is actually pretty broad. So if you're thinking about expanding the pool of female engineers, your pipeline might extend all the way back to middle school, as Facebook is finding out, for example. So with that in hand, what I'd like to do is I'd like to offer a perspective on what corporate learning might look like in 2025. My favorite movie is Back to the Future. So I've always wanted to get in the DeLorean. So let's take the DeLorean and go and visit 8 people who are experiencing the world of corporate learning in 2025. And I want to share this perspective through their specific prism, through their eyes. So I'd like to start by going to Detroit, Michigan. And I want to visit Chloe. And Chloe's the CEO of an automotive company. Well, really not an automotive company anymore, a mobility company. She's facing a world in 2025 where she has to compete with the #1 mobility company, which is Tesla. So she's got a very different situation than she had maybe 5 years ago. That mobility company needs a whole different set of capabilities. It needs to know more about electric vehicles, the electric infrastructure, autonomous driving, changes in urbanization. She needs urban planners. She needs a different kind of set of coders. Today's average high-end car has more code, roughly 7 times the code of a Boeing 787. So the question in her mind is, do her auto workers have the necessary data science skills, electronics, design thinking, mechatronics, and coding skills necessary to innovate the car and any form of transportation of the future? So what Chloe's actually in the middle of in 2025 is the kind of retooling of skills that we talked about a few minutes ago that AT&T is going through. So my first proposition is that CEOs in the future will need to try and turn the Titanic in order to avoid its fate. In other words, they'll need to retool their organization-wide capabilities on a massive and unprecedented global scale in the face of these new competitive threats. And the real implication for them is, how do you reskill 200,000 people in 5 years? And that's an absolutely staggering problem, and let me put it in perspective. Stanford has just 7,000 undergraduates, 7,000 undergraduates. And companies that are global are thinking about how to build the capabilities in several years' time of 200,000 people or face irrelevance. Now let's look at another CEO. Let's go to Munich in Germany and visit Yins. He's the CEO of an industrial conglomerate. The conglomerate has 12 businesses, operates in 65 countries. It manages a vendor part network of 3,500 partners. And one of the things he collectively realizes is he has this very significant leadership deficit. So not only do very few of his leaders have the full complement of leadership skills in this very complex organization, but they're leading a fundamentally changed workforce. Much of the work has been automated, much work is specialized, and the remaining work feels like it's changing every year. And many of his leaders, think about this, don't even know anything about the skills of the people they're leading. They're having to lead while continuing to learn themselves. So Jens decides he needs to start a different kind of leadership program. He starts listing all the people he needs to develop, and pretty soon, working together with his head of global HR, he realizes he's got a problem. Out of 30,000 employees, about 3,000 are really pretty important leaders. So he looks at this pretty big mess he's got himself into and thinks, how am I going to build the capabilities of 3,000 leaders? So this brings me to my second proposition, which is, forget the top 300, it's all about the top 3,000 or the top 30,000. And the implication for the future is, how do you build a new type of leader for the new future of work? I'd now like to go and visit another executive, John Chiang. So John is the CLO of a telecommunications company, and he realizes he needs to change the role of learning and development to support his company's current transformation. And I really want to focus on this point about a current transformation. It feels these days like every company is going through some very significant transformation. I want to pick on this one. So John works for a telecommunications company in Dallas, and his company's just acquired another wireless company. And the underlying rationale for this whole transaction is to improve performance by reducing churn in the customer base and improving revenue growth. So that means that two parts of the organization are now more important than any, and they are customer care and sales. The digital part of customer care, the human part of customer care. And what John finds as he evaluates his organization and that of the acquired company is that the organizations are different, the cultures are far apart, there's no common language, there are differing degrees of leadership and accountability, and people actually have different skills. So he reflects on the journey ahead, and together with his CEO decides to focus the entire corporate learning enterprise on improving the skills, culture, and performance, specifically in the customer care and sales organizations, and the roles that are most important in those two parts of the company in driving value. And for these roles, they create bespoke learning journeys, and he decides that for now, everything else in corporate learning must be deprioritized. Which brings me to my third proposition, that in the future, corporate learning is going to need to be fit for transformation. And you need to know exactly what transformation it is that your company's in the middle of. And what's the implication of that? The implication is we need more build-to-order learning journeys. Given the transformation, the people you're trying to train, what does their learning journey look like over the next 5 years? Now let's travel over to the UK and visit Cynthia, who's the Chief Learning Officer of a global healthcare company. And she finds herself needing to set up an approach and mechanism to deliver personalized and adaptive learning at scale for everyone in her organization. So her company is both a payer and a provider. So an insurance company and a company that also runs hospitals and primary care networks. So let me give you a sense of the challenges she faces. She's got primary care physicians and nurses, academic researchers, hospital administrators, hardware and software experts in the hospitals who are working on quantified self and population health. And on the payment side, she has payment experts, people working on payment innovation, people focusing on insurance coverage, actuaries, machine learning experts, data science experts, customer service reps, and this list just goes on. So the scale of the different people and capabilities she's got is quite staggering. So she undertakes a global inventory of the capabilities she's got. And what she realizes is that the performance varies so much across the company and so much within a role that the only way she can possibly deal with this is to have personal adaptive learning. She has to have learning on demand, different learning modalities, and she needs the infrastructure to support that. She needs a self-learning system that can adapt as people learn or stumble in different areas, and she needs to meet those people where they are. So my fourth proposition is that in the future, we're going to need industrialized individual learning on a scale we're yet to imagine. And the real question is, how do you drive that personalized, adaptive, and also experiential learning at significant scale? We're not talking about dozens or hundreds of people. We're talking about thousands. I'm going to now go back to New York, which is where I'm from, and let's visit Michael, who's the global head of talent for a global asset management firm. And he's trying to figure out ways to connect learning programs to business performance. He's got some very significant problems in the asset management business. The return on equity is declining. The cost of asset management products is declining as it gets competed away and products get commoditized. So he's trying to figure out how to create an edge. And this particular asset management company he's working at has decided that the way to create an edge is by investing in a distinctive workforce that builds the capabilities of its people, which is something that financial services companies have historically underinvested in. So he starts talking to the leaders of his company, and he realizes the bar is pretty high on getting any investment for learning. So he realizes he needs to show a direct connection between learning and business performance. And it's not going to be any more talking about how much did you enjoy a course or would you recommend the course. The question is, what value did you drive? Which brings me to my fifth proposition, which is that all learning will be evidence-based and it'll be evidence of value. And the implication of this might be, do we need a new metric, which is learning alpha, which is how much value above and beyond ordinary performance does learning add? I want to now take a visit to Tokyo, Japan, and visit Yumi, who's a frontline sales staff in a fast fashion company. Now, fast fashion works in a pretty interesting way. The labor costs are pretty high, but the turnover is pretty high. And so there's actually not that much time to train people because they've got to be out on the floor selling. So how do you deal with this particular problem? Well, in 2025, we may face a world where Yumi is wearing wearables, and those wearables are a mobile learning assistant. They're telling her real-time what to do based on the feedback she's getting from the customer. She's immediately looking at suggestions based on real-time natural language processing of what the customer is saying. And so think about a program like that, which is showing a lift in customer satisfaction and improvement in revenue per interaction. That's the kind of new experiential learning that might come to dominate corporate learning. And imagine that before she comes to work that day, Yumi is also doing some experiential training. Before coming onto the reordered shop floor, because in fast fashion the merchandise changes every 2 weeks, she walks through a potential sale using her VR gear, and an augmented reality simulation lets her walk through the potential sales encounter she's going to face that day. Which brings me to my sixth proposition, which is experiential learning will dominate corporate learning. And the implication is, how do we use augmented and virtual reality to learn today, apply today, and practice tomorrow? I'm going to skip now to Rebecca, who works in Ohio, and she's the head of recruiting for an advanced manufacturing company. And basically, the problem she's got is the following. She can no longer successfully predict who's going to be successful when she hires them. And what she starts to see is some of the traditional facts we know about people, which is where they went to university, what they learned, what their grade point average is. All of those things have become more or less meaningless in predicting performance. So she started looking at other things, like mindset-based factors like grit and resilience. But she also starts to think about new ways to judge where people acquire their skills. And she starts to focus much more on where people acquire their skills. So she starts to say, actually for marketing, I need people who've been trained at P&G. And my machine learning people need a heritage of Netflix. And my engineers, boy, I'd like to get some engineers from SpaceX. And so she starts to think very interestingly about credentialing. And she starts to think about new ways in which she can use labor platforms and the new ways in which she can use LinkedIn and other places to get granular data, companies like Burning Glass. So this is my seventh and second to last proposition, which is that in the future, companies will become the new credentialers. Might the implication be that in the future, you go to McKinsey for strategy and leadership, Amazon or Google for digital, and IDEO for design thinking, and the list goes on. I want to make the last stop in this trip, which is to see Prasanna, who works in engineering at SAS, the analytics company in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's a great engineer from North Carolina State, but he wants to shift into a broader product management role, and he decides to further build his interpersonal leadership and management skills. So he enrolls in a blended management course from perhaps McKinsey Academy. He takes a series of short courses on strategy, business planning, and team management, and he earns a series of micro-credentials in management. And it turns out there are 150 other people in Raleigh enrolled in this program, so they attend in-person sessions together at the local General Assembly. Which brings me to my eighth proposition, which is that the real action will take place after graduation as a revolution in lifelong learning begins. And what's the implication of this? We might find that institutions take on the role of helping their graduates renew their skills every 5 years. And it might become commonplace for people to have 2 to 5 hours a week of lifelong learning. So what happens when you add this all up? I'd offer the following. Be bold and start with a clean sheet. The times demand nothing less. The first thing to do is set a goal for corporate learning, and that is help your talent create value. The second is know the transformation that your company is undertaking. Really, how is your company trying to change? Third, develop the corporate learning blueprint that's fit for that transformation. Fourth, design and deliver a corporate learning program that meets the needs of that transformation. Fifth, measure learning alpha. What value did that create? And lastly, adjust repeatedly. In conclusion, I would simply say, welcome to the new corporate learning, where it'll be all about helping talent create value. Thank you.